Most people think learning depends on intelligence, that some brains are just better than others. Richard Feynman didn't believe that at all. He believed learning is a skill, and like any skill, it can be controlled. In this video, I'll show you the exact method Feynman used to force his brain to understand anything, not by memorizing more, but by thinking differently. If you've ever studied hard and still felt lost, this will completely change how you learn. Most people think learning happens when information enters the brain, but Richard Feynman understood something far more important. Learning happens when the brain is forced to produce information, not consume it. Reading, watching, or listening can create familiarity, but familiarity is not understanding. Your brain recognizes patterns and feels comfortable, so it tricks you into believing you've learned something. Feynman warned against this illusion. The moment you try to explain an idea in your own words, that illusion collapses. Explanation is a test your brain cannot fake. When you explain, your mind must organize thoughts, connect ideas logically, and choose clear language. If something is missing or unclear, you feel it instantly. That discomfort is not a weakness. It is proof that learning has begun. When you attempt to explain a concept simply, especially as if you were speaking to a child or a beginner, your brain is forced into clarity. Big words and technical language can hide confusion, but simple words cannot. This is why Feynman believed simplicity was the ultimate test of understanding. If you truly understand something, you can explain it without hiding behind jargon. When you can't, it means there are gaps in your knowledge. These gaps are valuable because they show you exactly what to work on. Instead of passively rereading everything, you now have a clear target. Your brain becomes active rather than passive, focused rather than distracted. Explanation changes how memory works. When you explain something, your brain is not just recalling facts, it is reconstructing meaning. This reconstruction strengthens neural connections far more than repetition ever could. Each time you explain an idea, you reorganize it slightly, making it clearer and more stable. This is why teaching something even once dramatically improves retention. Feynman used this constantly. He would write explanations in plain language and revise them until they made sense without reference to textbooks. He wasn't trying to sound smart. He was trying to be honest with his understanding. The power of explanation lies in its brutality. Your brain cannot hide behind partial knowledge when words must come out in order. Mid-sentence pauses, awkward phrasing, or sudden confusion reveal exactly where understanding breaks down. Most people avoid this moment because it feels uncomfortable. Feynman welcomed it. He knew that pretending to understand was far more dangerous than admitting ignorance. Explanation forces humility, and humility is essential for learning. The brain learns fastest when it stops protecting its ego and starts seeking clarity. Another hidden benefit of explanation is attention. When you know you must explain something later, your brain listens differently. It doesn't just absorb information, it evaluates it. It asks, how would I explain this? That question transforms passive exposure into active learning. Even during reading or watching, your brain begins organizing information in a way that makes sense to you, not just the source. This internal dialogue deepens understanding long before you formally explain anything. Explaining also exposes false confidence. Many learners mistake recall for understanding. They can repeat definitions, formulas, or examples, but when asked to explain why something works, everything falls apart. Feynman believed that true understanding means you can approach an idea from multiple angles, explain it using different examples, and adapt it to new situations. Explanation reveals whether knowledge is flexible or fragile. If it collapses under slight pressure, it was never real learning to begin with. What makes this method so powerful is that it puts you in control. You don't wait for motivation or inspiration. You decide to explain and your brain responds. This is how learning becomes something you can trigger on command. You don't need an audience. You can explain out loud to yourself, write in a notebook, or imagine teaching someone who knows nothing about the topic. The brain reacts the same way. It shifts into construction mode, building understanding piece by piece. Over time, this habit changes how you think. You stop chasing shortcuts and start valuing clarity. You become less impressed by complex language and more interested in simple explanations. This shift is what made Feynman exceptional. He didn't aim to know more than others, he aimed to understand better. Explanation was his tool, and it can be yours too. When learning feels slow or frustrating, explanation is the solution. It exposes what you don't know, strengthens what you do know, and turns confusion into progress. The moment you explain something clearly, even imperfectly, Your brain has already learned more than hours of passive study could achieve. That is why learning truly begins the moment you try to explain. Most people treat confusion as a sign that something is wrong. The moment they feel lost, they assume the subject is too hard or that they are not smart enough. Richard Feynman believed the opposite. To him, confusion was not a failure of intelligence. It was evidence that the brain had reached the edge of what it currently understood. That edge is where learning actually begins. When something feels confusing, it means your brain is being forced to confront the difference between what it thinks it knows and how reality actually works. That gap is not a problem to avoid. It is the exact place where understanding is built. The brain naturally prefers certainty. Familiar ideas feel safe and repeating them feels productive. But familiarity creates comfort, not knowledge. Feynman warned that the most dangerous learning state is when you feel confident but cannot explain why something works. Confusion shatters that false confidence. It exposes hidden assumptions and forces the brain to slow down. In that slowdown, the mind becomes more precise. Instead of skimming over details, it starts examining them carefully. This shift from speed to clarity is essential for deep learning. When confusion appears, many people immediately escape it. They reread the same paragraph, watch another video, or look for an easier explanation. While this can sometimes help, it often delays real learning. Feynman approached confusion differently. He stayed with it. He believed that sitting inside confusion trains the brain to think more clearly. By resisting the urge to escape discomfort, the mind begins asking better questions. Why doesn't this make sense? Which part is unclear? What assumption am I making that might be wrong? Each question sharpens understanding. Confusion is also a signal of growth. You cannot be confused by something completely outside your knowledge. Confusion only happens when new information collides with what you already know. That collision forces the brain to update its mental model. Without confusion, learning becomes shallow because nothing is being challenged. Feynman understood that real understanding requires rebuilding ideas, not just adding new ones. Confusion is the demolition phase of that rebuilding process. There is also an emotional side to confusion. Feeling lost can trigger fear, embarrassment, or frustration. Many learners avoid confusion to protect their self-image. Feynman had no patience for this. He believed that honesty with yourself was more important than looking smart. Admitting confusion is an act of intellectual courage. The moment you say, "I don't understand this yet," your brain relaxes and becomes curious instead of defensive. Curiosity keeps the mind open while ego shuts it down. Another reason confusion is valuable is that it provides direction. When you feel confused, you don't need to study everything again. Confusion points directly to the weak spot. That makes learning more efficient. Instead of drowning in information, you focus on the exact concept that doesn't make sense. Feynman believed that targeted struggle was far more effective than endless repetition. One clear question answered deeply is worth more than hours of passive review. Confusion also trains patience. Modern learning often promises speed, shortcuts, and instant results. Feynman rejected this mindset. He knew that some ideas take time to mature in the mind. Sitting with confusion allows ideas to settle, connect, and reorganize. During this process, the brain forms stronger and more flexible understanding. Rushing past confusion might feel productive, but it weakens long-term comprehension. Over time, embracing confusion changes your relationship with learning. Instead of fearing difficult topics, you begin to welcome them. Confusion becomes a sign that you are doing something meaningful. This mindset shift is powerful. It removes anxiety and replaces it with curiosity. Learning stops being about proving intelligence and starts being about discovering truth. Feynman's greatest strength was not that he was never confused, but that he was willing to be confused longer than others. He trusted that clarity would emerge if he stayed honest and persistent. By treating confusion as a guide rather than an enemy, he turned uncertainty into insight. When you stop running from confusion, you gain control over learning. You no longer depend on perfect explanations or ideal conditions. You can sit with difficulty, ask precise questions, and rebuild understanding step by step. That is how confusion becomes a tool instead of an obstacle. It is not a sign that you are failing. It is proof that learning is happening. The human brain struggles with complexity not because it is weak, but because it is honest. It cannot truly understand something that has too many moving parts at once. Richard Feynman recognized this early in his learning and teaching. He believed that every complex idea, no matter how intimidating it seems, is built from simple pieces. If even one of those pieces is unclear, the entire structure becomes unstable. This is why breaking complex ideas into simple parts is not just helpful but essential for real understanding. Most people approach difficult subjects by trying to swallow everything whole. They read entire chapters, watch long lectures, and hope understanding will somehow appear. What usually happens instead is surface familiarity. The brain recognizes terms and patterns but cannot explain how they connect. Feynman refused to accept this kind of vague knowledge. When something didn't make sense, he didn't move on. He isolated the part that confused him and focused on it alone. By shrinking the problem, he made it solvable. Breaking ideas down forces clarity. When you take a large concept and divide it into smaller components, your brain can examine each one without being overwhelmed. Each piece becomes a simple question instead of a complex mystery. This process reduces cognitive load and allows the mind to focus deeply. Feynman treated learning like repairing a machine. You don't fix the entire machine at once, you identify the faulty part, understand how it works, and repair it before moving on. This method also reveals hidden assumptions. Many complex ideas feel confusing because they rely on concepts we think we understand but actually don't. When you break things down, these weak foundations become obvious. Feynman believed that pretending to understand the basics was the fastest way to remain confused. He insisted on understanding ideas from the ground up, even if that meant revisiting material others considered elementary. There was no shame in this for him. Only clarity mattered. Simplifying does not mean dumbing things down. It means stripping away unnecessary complexity until the core idea is visible. Feynman was famous for explaining advanced physics, using everyday language and simple examples. He did this not to impress others, but to test his own understanding. If an idea could not survive simplification, it was not yet understood. This ruthless simplicity is what made his thinking so powerful. Another benefit of breaking ideas into parts is flexibility. When you understand individual components, you can rearrange them, combine them, and apply them in new ways. This is the difference between memorization and mastery. Memorized knowledge is rigid. It works only in familiar situations. True understanding, built from simple parts, adapts easily. Feynman could move between problems effortlessly because he understood the underlying pieces, not just the final formulas. This approach also turns learning into an active process. Instead of passively accepting information, you constantly ask, what is this made of? And how does this part connect to the others? These questions keep the brain engaged and curious. Learning becomes a construction project rather than a storage task. You are not collecting facts, you are building a structure of understanding. Breaking complexity also makes learning less intimidating. Large topics often create anxiety because they feel impossible to grasp. By dividing them into small, manageable pieces, you regain a sense of control. Each small insight builds confidence and momentum. Feynman understood that confidence comes from clarity, not from pretending. Small wins accumulate into deep understanding. Over time, this habit changes how your brain handles new information. Instead of being overwhelmed, it automatically searches for structure. It looks for building blocks and relationships. Complex ideas stop feeling mysterious and start feeling navigable. This is how learning becomes something you can direct, not something that happens by chance. Feynman's genius was not that he saw complexity where others did not, but that he saw simplicity where others were intimidated. By breaking ideas down into their simplest parts, he turned confusion into clarity. This process takes patience and honesty, but it rewards you with understanding that lasts. When you master the parts, the whole takes care of itself. Most people study by consuming information. They read pages, watch lectures, highlight notes, and feel productive, but very little of that information becomes usable knowledge. Richard Feynman believed this was the biggest mistake learners make. The brain does not learn deeply when it is passive. It learns when it is forced to act. Teaching, even without an audience, is the most powerful way to force the brain into active learning. When you teach, your mind must organize ideas, choose clear language, and present thoughts in a logical order. This process transforms vague familiarity into real understanding. Active teaching immediately exposes weak points. When you try to explain something out loud or in writing, your brain can no longer hide behind recognition. The moment you hesitate, struggle for words, or lose your train of thought, you have found the exact place where understanding is missing. This is incredibly valuable because it removes guesswork. Instead of wondering what to study, teaching shows you precisely what needs work. Feynman valued this clarity. He believed that knowing what you don't understand is more important than memorizing what you do. Teaching also strengthens memory in a way passive review never can. When you explain an idea, your brain reconstructs it from meaning rather than repeating it from memory. This reconstruction strengthens neural pathways and makes recall easier and more flexible. Each time you teach the same concept, it becomes clearer and more refined. Feynman often rewrote explanations repeatedly, not because he forgot them, but because each rewrite improved clarity. The act of teaching turns knowledge into something living and adaptable. One of the most powerful aspects of teaching is that it demands simplicity. You cannot teach effectively using confusion or jargon. Teaching forces you to choose examples, analogies, and explanations that make sense to someone else. This pressure towards simplicity is exactly what the brain needs to learn deeply. Feynman believed that complexity often hides ignorance. Teaching strips that disguise away. If an idea cannot be taught simply, it has not yet been understood. Teaching without an audience works just as well. You don't need students or a classroom. You can teach to an imaginary person. A blank page or even an empty room. Speaking out loud forces structure. Writing forces precision. The brain responds the same way because the demand is the same: clarity. Feynman often talked ideas through with himself, testing explanations until they felt solid. This habit allowed him to learn independently and efficiently. Another reason teaching locks knowledge in is that it creates emotional engagement. When you teach, you care whether the explanation makes sense. This emotional investment increases attention and focus. The brain remembers information better when it is emotionally involved. Teaching turns learning from a chore into a challenge. Each successful explanation reinforces confidence, while each failure becomes an opportunity to improve understanding. Teaching also encourages questions. As you explain, new questions naturally arise. Why does this step work? What happens if this part changes? These questions deepen understanding and reveal connections between ideas. Feynman believed that curiosity was the engine of learning, and teaching fuels that curiosity. Instead of accepting information as fixed, you explore it actively. Over time, active teaching changes how you approach learning. You stop studying to pass tests or complete tasks. You start studying to explain. This shift dramatically improves comprehension. You begin to anticipate confusion and address it early. You build mental models instead of memorizing details. Learning becomes intentional and controllable. Feynman's method shows that learning on command is not about forcing information into the brain, but about forcing the brain to work. Teaching is that force. It turns passive exposure into active construction. When you teach, you reveal gaps, strengthen memory, simplify complexity, and build confidence. Knowledge stops being something you temporarily hold and becomes something you truly own. This is why teaching is the final step that locks learning in and makes understanding last.